I'm Vicki Hogarth, and welcome to Southwest Magazine. The second annual Women and Addiction Symposium took place in Moncton this past April. Here to tell us all about it are Dr. Russell King, former Health Minister of New Brunswick, and Chair of the Board of Portage Atlantic, as well as Heather Chase, Community Developer at Horizon Health. Thank you both so much for being here today and coming in to talk about this. Can we start off, Dr. King, talking about what are some of the unique challenges women face with addiction?
Well, there are quite a few. One of the common ones, and an important one, is that they don't seek out help or treatment, and particularly if they have young children. And sometimes they just don't seek help because they don't want to lose their children, or they're afraid that the system might look on them unfavorably, and so they will forego treatment. And there can be abuse involved, and they have their own self-pride, and they bear the family pride, and they don't want it made known, and they don't want to discuss that with anyone, and so they tend to put off. And then you have other determinants of health that make it do it. If they're a distance from where they could get help, there's just the physical thing of transportation, particularly if there's only one car or there isn't a car. Those are the things. And then their sense of self, their own pride, they don't want to admit that there's a problem, which is common to many people that have addiction, and so they avoid it.
Heather, is there anything you would add to that?
I think definitely the push to keep the family intact and keep their children together and the family together is definitely something that I hear a lot. And one of the interesting things, just as I was listening to Dr. King speak, was during COVID, some of the nonprofits moved some of their addiction support online. And there were some women that I know that actually then started taking an opportunity to seek help and support because people weren't seeing them go into certain buildings. So I can think of one woman in particular who had a fairly high-ranking position with a large nonprofit company in the city, and she finally felt that she could go get help because no one was going to see her go in that building. She could do it from the safety of her home. And I think that's where, as long as internet's available and there's a safe space at home to have treatment, that in-home treatment and support can be very helpful. And I do think there is a different stigma that women feel when they suffer with addiction, because, you know, I've heard them say before, people feel if you loved your kids enough, you could really fight this, without understanding what's happening when someone has addiction and what the underlying causes are. So there's that added burden of, you're the mom, you should be strong enough for this, and we know that that's actually not the case. That's not the issue at all.
Portage Atlantic hosted the Women in Addiction Symposium. Right. Why was this something that Portage wanted to take on and make women the focus of?
Well, we think in New Brunswick there's a need for a mother and child program. We are affiliated with operations in Montreal, and we've had a program for 21 years in Montreal, and it really works on the line of what you mentioned with the family unit. We treat the family unit. And so, without going into too much minutia, but in the program we have the mother and the child. The child is under 5. They sleep and eat. They have their own quarters, if you like, during the program. And then in the morning, after they've done the standard cleanup, she takes the child down the hall to a daycare. But the daycare isn't just a babysitting service. We've been plugged into McGill, to Concordia, and perhaps Lorval, I'm not sure that last point. But it's the children of addiction is an entity in itself. It's not just children of addiction. But the child of addiction is something that you have to have people that are trained to pick that up, because they start, they're exposed to acute childhood circumstances at an early age, and that is cumulative, begins to have an effect on people. Or there are some things such as ADHD or attention deficit disorder, which many mums may have had. It's more common in men, but many of the mothers have, and there's a tendency for that to run in children if that happens. So it's a mother. So what I've explained is a mom and a child, and you've got the basic of a family. And the Mother and Child program is really a family supportive organization or endeavor. And so we had the symposium. This is, as you pointed out, the second symposium, and we had that to point attention to the trials and the challenges that women have. And if they have children, they have different challenges, but added to those which they already have if they were by themselves. Mm-hmm. And I think it seems to be identified. Just to digress a little bit, the whole business of addiction is a major public health issue. And we have a public health system in New Brunswick, and I think it works very well. But I don't think, I think there's an opportunity for us to start to treat addiction as a family problem, for sure. But if we start to treat it as a public health issue, it puts the onus on us to think about the causes, mm-hmm. to think about what you can do about the causes, to think about the social ramifications of doing nothing or of addressing the causes. And it can be a structure of basic social policy. So there's advantages, in our opinion, to government as well. People understand what public health is about, or most people do. And I think to put it as a public health issue gives the whole issue of addiction a little more respect and a little more feeling that there's a public game plan. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the reasons that we put the symposium together, and I think both of them have been successful, although the first one we did in St. John, we weren't able to compete with Fiona. We lost a lot of the people that were supposed to come from Newfoundland. And our audience, we had a lot of people from the civil service, which is the backbone of any social policy. They're the ones that make it happen. Mm-hmm. Regardless of all the talk, you can have a lot on paper, but to get it from the paper to an actual fact, you need a good, strong, competent civil service. And I think we're fortunate in New Brunswick.
I was fortunate enough to go to both symposiums, and in this year's symposium, Heather Chase was one of the presenters, Charlotte County's own Heather Chase. I'd love you to tell people at home what your presentation was about. Just give us an overview.
Sure. So one of the areas that I focus on is adverse childhood experiences, which from a public health perspective or population health perspective, there's a connection there between adversity in childhood and all of the physical, psychological, and socioeconomic issues that we deal with in society. And Dr. Robert Anda, who was one of the original investigators of the study, he always says what's predictable is preventable. Mm-hmm. And we know that people who have a high history of trauma are destined to have a higher risk for certain illnesses and certain disorders and diseases, such as addiction is one of them. And if we know that, then we should be monitoring individuals like we do. I get my cholesterol checked because cholesterol runs in my family. So we're aware that I have a higher risk for potential cardiac issues. So my healthcare provider and I watch for that. So if we know if individuals have a history of trauma, there are lots of things that we should be watching for. So we could start incorporating that into some of our interventions and screening processes from healthcare. But what I found very helpful and useful as I was providing my presentation was the diversity of people in the audience. So one of the pieces that I talk about is that ACEs impacts us all, and it impacts us across the life course and actually intergenerationally, usually 2 to 3 generations down the line. And we look at the issues that could be linked back to ACEs. It requires a diversity of approaches from healthcare, education, justice and public safety. So talking about that connection was part of the understanding ACEs that I cover. And I was very happy Dr. Nicole Sharon, who spoke, she is a neuroscientist, so I didn't have to cover the brain stuff, which is wonderful. I can if I have to, but she's way more qualified than I. But just really helping people understand that trauma does impact the brain. You can understand how it impacts the amygdala and the hippocampus, but at the end of the day, for regular people, just know trauma impacts the brain. And if you know that, that's helpful. And then we really talked about that intergenerational transmission. So we know if kids are growing up in a household where mom or dad have an addiction issue or an untreated mental health issue, they are at higher risk for potential outcomes related to ACEs. And also understanding the cultural components. So we understand that within certain populations there is that historical trauma that comes forward. And when we're trying to support individuals, we really need to understand and recognize the severity of that. So that was kind of the science component, because I do feel it's important that we always recognize that this is scientifically sound. We have countries now across the world that are actually embedding the science of ACEs in their program and policy and social policy pieces, and that once we know that it's scientifically true, because we still hear things sometimes like if people just tried harder, and I think we know when your brain is fundamentally changed, there are ways that we can mitigate the risk and develop coping mechanisms, but your brain is your brain. We all have one, and it's all developed based on our environments that we're born into. And also talking about, in particular for this conference, it was the impact on kids. And we really know that the best way to help a child is to help mom or dad. And in this instance, we were talking about the moms. So what I really appreciate about the Portage model is that it provides a safe environment for mom and child, so that mom can get the treatment that she's seeking, but also the kids can get the support in an appropriate way. When I was preparing for the conference, I was reviewing some best practices for children of parents who have addiction issues. And one of the best things that we can do is remind kids that their job is to be a kid, not the caretaker, not to run the household, because sometimes so much pressure is placed on a child. And if they're in a supportive environment where they can understand, mom is sick, but we're here treating her, and that's great. And also to be able to connect with other children who are experiencing the same thing is very helpful. We know as adults, peer support can be very helpful, and to talk with other people who understand what I'm going through. For children, it's the same. So I think that that's, really important. And, also, Sesame Street has wonderful resources for anything nowadays, and they have some really great little videos to help promote conversation with children in a way that's appropriate, because sometimes I think we do kids a disservice thinking that they can't understand. Kids know, whether we tell them or not. So let's try to inform them with appropriate information for their age and understanding. So that was kind of the second component, was just talking about how we can support kids. And as a community, we all have responsibilities there. We've the pendulum has swung more towards being individuals. And what we know is humans, we're designed to be in community together. And that means trying to help out our neighbor the best we can. And we've kind of gotten away from that, and I think COVID kind of stimulated that a little bit. But hopefully we're swinging back now to recognize we live in community together and we have a responsibility for each other. And on that note, the last piece I usually wrap up with is providing care for the carer. So if you work in treatment or in addiction, or if you're a person there, it's a lot. It's heavy work, and what we know from trauma is more people have a history of trauma than don't. So people are bringing that to work every day, and then and trying to provide the best care that they can where they're dealing with their own issues as well. So just taking a few minutes to remember, like, we do need to do good self-care so that we can provide the best care and support that we want.
You bring up the aspect of community, and we've talked a lot about the need for policy changes. But what do communities have to do to better support dealing with addiction, as we see it become such an increasingly problematic thing, even in our small communities?
Mm-hmm. I think the biggest thing is that we need to understand that addiction is an illness. When someone gets cancer, we see the community circle around them to support, which is wonderful. We should. But we don't always see the same thing when someone is struggling with an addiction issue. And I think that we need to have those community conversations to recognize that every person is a person and is worthy of respect and support. And I think as well, from that community level support, we need to see investments made so that our really good nonprofits have sustainability and can hire people with appropriate skills and training. And one of the things that I notice, just speaking here locally, I know we're here talking about women and children, but if you're a man in Southwest New Brunswick, there are not a lot of informal community-based programs for you to access, which is a bit of a gap that I see and I hear in my work. So it's important to look at that. But I think just having the conversation and increasing people's awareness that individuals who struggle with addiction, there's usually an underlying root cause for that. And if we can try to understand that as opposed to the behavior that someone might exhibit that makes you feel uncomfortable or unsafe, and that's valid too, we need to understand where people are coming from when they're struggling with addiction and try to recognize that.
Dr. King, I loved at the symposium that so many of the presenters used a lot of data to really make their cases about what they were talking about. Do you still feel, though, that there are misconceptions that create barriers to people getting help to addiction?
There are many barriers, and that was one of the underlining themes. The barriers can be the word predictability. If they have addiction, the whole situation is aggravated by many factors. One is taking it to the child. The child craves indirectly, and we need to see that a predictable absence of violence is there. Another barrier is inconsistent behavior. That can be, we have food on Mondays, but not so much the rest of the week. We lived in this house or this tent last week, and we're living in a different place. Mm-hmm. The child needs to have predictability. They don't present saying, I need more predictability. But there needs to be predictability because, as was also talked about, these traumas to the child are cumulative. Mm-hmm. Like it's chipping away. And as our first presenter, Dr. Terrian, talked about this actually, if you, for simplicity's sake, thinking there's a molding of the brain and it's added to this bit. And the sooner you can get the child in some kind of organized, knowledgeable treatment, the better, which takes us back to the mum, which is the key to the family unit, as far as I'm concerned. I wouldn't admit that to my wife, but that's another story. But that's true. If you can, if a mother who is a woman who is expecting presents, and it's found out that she has addiction, or she mentions she has addiction, then you can start before the birth of the child and do things that cut down on this cumulative snowball effect of every time you turn the snowball once, it just keeps adding. And so consistency of determinants of health or availability of that, consistency of even the treatment that people get, rather than running off with, well, I saw something on whatever media or in a magazine, and should we try that? There needs to be confidence on the part of the mom that the people that are trying to help her, and plus or minus the child, know what they're doing. And there has to be a feeling transmitted as part of the therapy that the therapist really cares about that person, first of all, and that they really care whether they start to get a more favorable outcome to control the addiction. And these aren't rocket science things, but they're things that undermine every social policy. And society, I think, has work to do. And what is a society? Well, you can't put your arms around all of it, but that's the case that we make, that addiction is a public health issue. And I think if you treat it as a public health issue, it has built-in accountability. Are we winning or losing? And that's not a little hokey question, but I think policy makers, policy designers, clinicians, whatever type they may be, need to think in terms of this family unit that's in front of us, who's fragile. Are we making headway? Are we really helping? Or are we just, well, okay, on Mondays we do this, and on Thursdays we do that? Or calendar bound, we get out the Christmas cards type thing. It's every day. Are we winning or losing this person? Which is also cumulative.
And where do you think, I'll start with you, Heather, are we winning? Are we moving forward? What are your thoughts after being at the symposium and hearing from all the presenters and talking to people in the room? Are we progressing when it comes to treating addiction?
I think some of the presenters shared some very good bright spots, like Dr. Sarah Gander, and some of the work that she's doing in St. John is wonderful. But that's one clinic in one location doing good work. How do we amplify that? And I think the big thing too is embedding trauma-informed care, which is, seeing the person in front of us and their history, and providing safe space, and for the individual to feel like they have choice and voice in their care and treatment is really important. That is starting to embed in system as well. The system is a really big ship, and for us to shift it takes time, and it's never fast enough. But there are some really good bright spots, and as we are starting to see the science of trauma and understanding how that impacts being shared at the population level, people are starting to push and ask for more. And we know that ideally the system change comes in the middle. So when we start to see the key leaders understanding how we need to focus on the public policy piece, and the people at the community level pushing up saying we need to work differently, that's when we start to see the system force change. I think one of our opportunities that's in front of us is recognizing that we all have a part to play in the solution. So although addiction tends to be focused around health, which is true, we also need to incorporate that in housing, in how we support the kids in the education system. If someone is going into the correction system, are we supporting them in a way that when they finish their term, then they're coming back to community in a healthier way? So I think going back to the social determinants of health framework, if we can move more into that collaborative and interdepartmental approach, we'll really start to see some good change building on what's already happened. And also remembering that at the end of the day, everyone lives in community. So at a community level, what can we do to work across the system to support the families when they're home?
And Dr. King, I'm going to leave the final thoughts of the show with you. Do you think we're making headway in terms of treating addiction and also getting rid of stigma?
I would say yes, but I don't think we have start sitting on our laurels, and we've got a long way to go. But I think there's increased understanding, And the reason I'm stressing a mother and child approach is that there's an opportunity to go through the components, to talk about the ACEs, to see whether you're winning or losing on this. And you come back to the determinants of health. If you have a predictable roof, predictable food source, and a predictable absence from bad attitudes or violence, if you can get up in the morning, whether you're the child or the mom, and you don't have to worry about whether you're going to be beaten for no good reason or someone else's reason, that's progress. It's progress in allowing the person to have more chance of controlling the addiction and modifying their life. And this has to be done in the whole thing. Once you bring it into a setting, it has to be a strong educational emphasis, because that's part of the road for the child in the future for their independence. And it increases their chance in the next generation to not have to think about determinants of health because they've provided them. And the community, there's a public education needs to be done, because this can't be done in a vacuum. It has to be done in a community setting, but there have to be key players. You can have an arena in a community, but if you're going to have a hockey game that people come to watch, you've got to have players. And there's a certain amount of regimen to it, because hockey sticks have to be a certain curve and have to be a certain size. You can't bring a baseball bat to a hockey game, and you shouldn't do it with public policy either.
Well, I appreciate you both so much for coming in today. I look forward to the 3rd annual Women in Addiction Symposium. I hope to see you both there as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My guests today have been Dr. Russell King, Chair of Portage Atlantic, and Heather Chase, Community Developer with Horizon Health. I'm Vicki Hogarth. Thank you for watching Southwest Magazine.
Southwest Magazine is a news and public affairs production of CHCO Television.